Welcome back. Here is part two of our review of English 3U. So we're picking back up with plays. We're still talking about dramatic plays, and these are the different parts that reflect dramatic plays. And so here we are with dramatis personae at the front of a play. There is always a list of all the characters that appear in the play. Um, we went over the main characters and the minor characters in, for instance, Macbeth, for instance, right? And so you would have all of that list of characters. Most of the time, it's the major characters, just because if there are a lot of characters, in particular minor characters, it can get a bit long. But you usually will see a list of all the characters that appear in the play. Their names are often accompanied by a brief note about the about that character's personality, their appearance, or their relationships with other characters in the play. That is dramatis personae. Um, and so, again, this is typically the major characters, but you can also find this as well with minor characters, in particular if they have speaking parts as well. But sometimes, they'll tell you, for instance, like in Act one, scene two, there were other people, servants in that scene that did not speak, but they were in that scene. So when the bleeding soldier was taken off, they went to see to him. Okay. And so stage directions is not difficult to understand what that means. Stage directions are any instructions that are provided by the author of the play that really direct the character's actions on the stage. Now, back when Shakespeare was writing, he really didn't have a lot of that. We learned that in the video about soliloquy with the gentleman at the Shakespeare Company. We was talking about Hamlet. And so a lot of times they talked, he spoke about how punctuation, something also that Shakespeare didn't use a lot of, but when he did, the punctuation at the end of the sentence gave cues of how to redirect and how the character would move around. And you just had to understand through reading the play what he wanted or expected the characters to do. And so, when it comes to stage directions, these cues, it could be notes about how to play the character. It could be what physical actions should take place in the scene or what props should be included in a scene. And so, again, sometimes you have it and other times you don't. And so, that is what stage directions are. They are the cues. It's everything that the actors as well as the director would need in order to bring the play to life in theater. Now, an aside, I mentioned this earlier, and we know this, the difference between an aside and a soliloquy. Asides are opportunities for us to learn more about the character and what's going on in their head. And so it is a type of stage direction where the actor turns to the audience and speaks to them. Oh, I missed it. I got aside and soliloquy mixed up. Sorry. The aside is where they're talking to the audience, right? And not to other characters. So we still get to see what's going on in the mind of that character. So the other characters, even though they may be on the stage with them, they cannot technically hear them because they are speaking directly to the um, audience, right? They reveal the characters' true feelings or even their secret plans. Whereas a soliloquy, again, I got that mixed up. So excuse me earlier. They're not often explicitly marked in the script, but sometimes they are. Asides are very much explicitly written in Shakespeare, especially in Macbeth. You will see he will write the word. You would see aside, so we would know what that is. So a soliloquy is often not that. And it's when a character also reveals their thoughts and feelings aloud while on the stage. And so, unlike an aside, a soliloquy um, is not spoken directly to the audience. Okay, this is where the character is basically talking to themselves. What they're basically thinking out loud to themselves, and so that's a soliloquy. Now, how do you identify a soliloquy? If you're reading a play, and you can usually identify soliloquy when it's usually longer than 10 lines. It's really long dialogue. usually, it's a long dialogue, and it's the character expressing hidden thoughts or emotions. A lot of times it's also location. Usually it's right before other characters enter or right after the characters exit. So it's a several different things. It's long text. It's text that expresses emotions or thoughts, and it occurs either before or after characters enter or leave the stage. And so that's how you can identify a soliloquy. Now, notes. Notes are brief explanations of maybe potentially unfamiliar words or references that are provided by the author or the editor of the script. So, for instance, when we were reading Sylvia Plath's Initiation, and there were little footnotes in the bottom of certain words that she was defining for us, because just because we think we know what the word means, sometimes the author is using it in a very unique way. It may be used as a way of slang or jargon or something like that. And so it's important to understand what they mean um, with a particular word. Um, when it comes to Shakespeare, especially, notes are very important, because the vocabulary is often unfamiliar to us. And we read it together and understanding that we had to use the dictionary at the same time to be able to understand certain words like hurly burly. We didn't know anything about what in the hurly burly act one, scene one, with the three weird sisters, the witches are talking about, when things are curling, and the one weird sister says in the hurly burly. So we had to look up that word, and there were several other words, lots of other words that we had to look up while reading that particular play. And so notes may appear as footnotes, used by numbers or symbols in some way in superscript above certain words or portions of text to let us know that we need to look down and read about what's going on. Or it could be small dots above certain words. It really just depends on the copy of the play that you're reading. Or the version of the play that you're reading. But that is the significance of notes. And notes, again, especially when it comes to Shakespeare, they are extremely important, because a lot of times, again, when he wrote it, there's a lot of terminology we don't use anymore. And along the way, those within the Shakespeare Company shared some insights into the expectations and what he was thinking, even though he did not directly write them sometimes within the play. So a lot of times there weren't stage directions or cues, so they had to figure it out, and they inserted them along the way or afterwards. So let's talk about dramatic conflict. Okay. So there are different types of conflict in drama. So there's internal, external, the interpersonal, social and cultural, and what we would call cosmic or fate driven. We're also going to get into the ones on the side for a moment. Let's into this for a moment. When it comes to internal conflict, we're talking about the psychological struggle or moral dilemma in a character's mind. We saw that with Macbeth and how he just turmoiled and talked within himself. First of all, he struggled with whether to really go forward with murdering King Duncan to succeed him. And then the conversation with Lady Macbeth as well. And then we saw some things with Lady Macbeth and how she was talking. So internal conflict refers to that. And this is why we also say that Macbeth is a psychological thriller. And so when it comes to internal conflict, we often see this portrayed through monologues, soliloquies, reflective dialogues, things like that, especially in soliloquies. Shakespeare's Hamlet is a perfect example of that. Again, we saw a clip of that, of Shakespeare's Hamlet and a soliloquy in a clip in one of our lessons. Let's say in Hamlet, understanding that Prince Hamlet, he is the protagonist, the main character, he faces a very complex internal conflict of it's more a moral dilemma of, do I avenge my father's murder? I mean, he's really torn up about this thing. And so his soliloquies that are most notably the one is to be or not to be. That's a speech that we hear often a lot that people quote recite a lot, reveal his moral and his existential struggles. He really struggled with whether to avenge his father's murder. He couldn't just let it go, but at the same time, is this really what I want to do or should be doing? And so, it's a matter of, it's a sense of duty to his deceased father to avenge him, but at the same time his intellectual ethical reservations about revenge are an issue. And so Hamlet has this internal conflict that serves as the psychological backbone of that particular drama named after him. And so this internal tug of war complicates his relationships with the other characters in the play. And that delves into some broader themes of morality, justice, and the human psyche overall. But again, we see this overarching theme of some of the issues and things that Shakespeare likes to play with. Now, when it comes to external conflict, we're talking about struggles between a character and any type of external entity. That could be another character, it could be nature, it could be society, it could be some abstract concept like fate, which is what we saw with between Macbeth, and with the weird sisters and him, his decision to try to conquer fate itself through this series of reckless decisions and unchecked ambition, right? And so that's where we see with external conflict. Interpersonal conflict arises when there's a struggle between two or more characters in the play. This is often driven by differing values, motivations, or even objectives. We see this again. We saw this between Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and even Banquo, right? But we can see it in his plays Romeo and Juliet. I mean, Shakespeare has so many plays, like 38 plays, 38 plays. And so we're looking at, so many different examples. Romeo and Juliet was one. Um, there was this long-standing feud between two families, that of Romeo and that of Juliet, and so the Montagues and the Capulets, and that feud is the backdrop. That's the backdrop of the plot, the story, right? And that complicates this whole thing, complicates the love affair between Romeo, the Montague, and Juliet, the Capulet. That whole feud, all of this animosity between these two families really creates this problematic dilemma for these two young lovers, right? They want to be together, but at the same time, it's they're torn between their honor and their loyalty to their respective families, and so that leads to a series of tragic events. They includes murder, banishment, and ultimately suicide, because the two lovers can successfully complete self-murder, suicide. And so this interpersonal conflict serves as a vehicle for examining, for instance, in this particular story of Romeo and Juliet, themes such as love, hatred, because the Montagues and the Capulets really detested one another, and the disastrous consequences of social division. And so that is what interpersonal conflict looks like. When it comes to social and cultural conflict, that's really about a struggle that sheds light on broader societal issues like class, racism, cultural norms. This is often implicated between multiple characters or even the entire setting of a play. Okay. Cosmic or fate driven conflict involves a struggle against larger, often uncontrollable forces, um, like, let's say, nature, gods, fate, things like that. It provides a broader lens for existential or spiritual discussions. Again, we got really deep into that when our conversations about Macbeth and the weird sisters, the witches, supernatural things, whether or not we believe in fate or do we take things into our own hands and just make decisions to create our own past. We can see this also in Shakespeare's King Lear, another one of his more popular plays. The title character, King Lear, faces this conflict against the fabric of the universe as he perceives it, um, and his decision to divide his kingdom among his daughters. Okay, based on this flattery, that unravels between them. And so there are certain events that lead to like familial betrayal, all kinds of crazy stuff. And now you have societal breakdown, because remember back then, in medieval times, and there are a lot of times when in Shakespeare was writing these things, when it was right with the kingdom, it was right with everything else. And so when things aren't right with the kingdom within the king's house, there's a breakdown in society, nature responds, and there's cosmic disorder. And so the tempest raging on the heath, for instance, that is a line within King Lear, um, symbolizes the cosmic conflict, right? Portraying Lear as this frail person in battle against vast, uncontrollable forces. Is this big thing that he's facing that he can't get a hold of? Obviously, you can't fight the universe. There's no such thing as that, right? And so King Lear's struggle is not just with his daughters, but also with the existential realities of his own mortality, because we are not going to live forever, no matter how hard people try, right? The unpredictability of fate. Is there such a thing as fate? You can argue that. Or you can be like Macbeth and try to take fate into your own hands and conquer it and see how that just falls apart. That just doesn't work. And the chaos of the natural world, because the natural world, there's an order, and when that order is out of balance, we see that it erupts into chaos, right? And we see all kinds of things that are happening, earthquakes and all this other stuff. And so that's what we mean by cosmic or fate driven. Now, again, in our lesson focused on alternative dramatic conflicts like character versus character. And that's where two or more characters oppose each other. There's a protagonist and an antagonist. And now this clash could be physical, it can be emotional, moral, or even intellectual. But we see that these characters are coming against each other. So it's like in Macbeth, for instance, we saw that with Macbeth and I'm trying to see the character at the end. Um, that he that opposed him so that Malcolm could ascend to the throne appropriately, right? More appropriately ascend to the throne. And so we saw that character versus character. You see this even with Macbeth versus Lady Macbeth at one point when she attacked his manhood in conversation and things, right? And so we also see this again in Hamlet. There was hostility between Hamlet and Claudius. And so Hamlet epitomizes that complex character versus character or man versus man conflict. Claudius ascended to the throne after murdering Hamlet's father. And so, this pits Hamlet against, Claudius. And now Hamlet is again, do I seek justice for my slain father? And we see that conflict. And so the conflict also between Hamlet and Claudius delves into more to deeper things. You see the universal things like power, betrayal, moral duty again in his soliloquy, and it culminates into this tragic finale that leaves multiple characters dead and the whole kingdom in disarray. Okay, that's where we see man versus man or conflict or character versus character as it relates to dramatic conflict. Okay, and so it's important again that we see these things and understand the importance of dramatic conflict. Now, character versus nature, where characters are pitted against natural forces like the weather, animals, geographical challenges, so on and so forth. That's what character versus nature is. There's also character versus society, where the protagonist, that is the main character, conflicts with societal norms, rules, or even cultural practices. And they often stand against collective prejudice, corruption, or other societal ills. And then there's character versus self. Okay, this is where we see that internal struggle within a character, and that's usually involving some type of doubt, ethical dilemma, or excuse me, or tough decision. Again, we saw this with Macbeth. Do I move forward with, murdering Duncan, the king, so that I can ascend to the throne, but at the same time, he's a good king. This is also my cousin. There's a struggle there. We saw that. We also saw it in Hamlet with his internal debate again about whether or not to avenge his father's death. And that's that man versus self conflict. So Hamlet's soliloquies provide a very good window, okay, into his internal struggle. It explores themes again like duty, mortality, the ethical ambiguity of revenge. Because is it revenge or am I avenging? Fine line there. There's a very fine line there, and that's why it's a dramatic conflict. So again, in terms of Macbeth, there's conflict. There's a conflict called character versus the supernatural. And so I didn't put this on here because it wasn't in our lesson, but we do want to address this because of the weird sisters in the presence of dealing with the supernatural and witchcraft and things like that. And it really creates this, or you see this conflict involving elements that transcend the laws of nature. Okay. This is often in like plays that delve into things like fantasy and horror. That's usually that genre. But back in the Elizabeth and Renaissance era, we didn't really have horror or fantasy genres, but we do now. Obviously, we have so many different literary dramas. Genres, and so you would see this in horror or fantasy genres. And so, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, we see this with the witches and their apparitions, right? And in we saw at least three different versions of the witches in Act One, Scene One, and how they would materialize or they would disappear in different ways. And so that is that character versus supernatural, right? That whole realm of what's real, what's not real. And so these supernatural elements serve not only as external forces that oppose Macbeth, but also are the catalyst for his internal moral dissent, because there was definitely a moral dissent. We saw that in real time as we read through the play, but also weaving together those different themes of fate, ambition, or rather unchecked ambition, and the consequences of that unchecked power. What happens when somebody just keeps going? They really just spiral out of control, and we saw that within that. All right. So let's move on and understand tragedies. And we're going to look at, in particular, Aristotle's definition. Now, I didn't put this on the screen. Obviously, you can go back and look at the previous PowerPoint slides that were sent to you, where it was actually on the slide. But let's get into how Aristotle defined a tragedy. Okay, because it's important, because this is how tragedies, even whether it's Elizabeth, the Renaissance era, or Greek tragedies, they all came into be. Now, how Aristotle came to this definition and all of the different parts of what makes a tragedy all came from his observations of plays during that era, during that time. And so he defined a tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious and as having magnitude, complete in itself, inappropriate and pleasurable language, in a dramatic rather than narrative form, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish a catharsis of these emotions. Now, let's look at the different parts of the definition because he said a lot, but a lot of that doesn't make sense to us in our language in our present time. In his time, it made sense. They would have understood that, but let's take a look at what this means. So, the first part of the definition, where Aristotle is talking about the magnitude of an action and its seriousness, refers to the great importance of the matter. The issue within the particular play has to be serious and very, very important. It can't be the main character got the flu. That's why a lot of tragedies deal with someone's death. Okay? It's tragic. It's got to be something that's jarring, right? Complete in itself means that the play must stick to the one issue. And while Macbeth has a lot of different things, it really under overarching is all the others wouldn't exist if there wasn't this one issue about ambition, because each one leads to the next, and we see what happens with unchecked ambition. It really becomes monstrous, and you have all these other things that go on. And so murder, okay, was the main, and violence was the main issue within Macbeth, right? So we ended up with that play experiencing lots and lots of death from character to character to character, even when it whether it was by murder or suicide. Okay, and so that's what that means. So the reason why it has to be complete in itself, the audience will get lost in the plot if there's too much going on. Everything was one issue. Macbeth murdered Duncan to ascend to the throne as king because the witches gave him a prophecy. That's it. And everything from there, the rest of the play wrote that whole thing out, right? When Aristotle speaks about the language of the play, okay, he's basically saying that it should be easy to listen to, with good rhythm and harmony. Why is he saying that? Um, in Greek tragedies, and even in some Elizabethan dramas, because in Shakespeare, we saw when we were looking at some of the videos about annotating it, we talked about pentameter and the pace. And so some of the parts are sung. So even with the weird sisters, i.e., the witches, some of their parts were actually sung. Okay. So some tragedies have choruses where the characters have to sing. And so the part about dramatic form is simple, it has to be acted out. There's no such thing as a play where no one is acting out a part in the character. There's no such thing as that. It has to be acted out in dramatic form. They have to deliver on the character. Now, plays don't necessarily have anyone narrating them. Okay, so they are theatrical and every word must be expressed on stage. That's why the actors have to be good, because if they weren't back then, people threw more than fruit at these people. Like they threw furniture and all kinds of things. It was very dangerous. So you not only did the play have to be good, the actors who were portraying the characters had to actually be good. So on to the next part. When Aristotle says, with incidents arousing pity and fear, let's dig into that, right? In a tragedy, the events or even the episodes in the play, as we look at the acts, the scenes, and the lines, right? Especially the scenes, um, it really should lead us, the audience, to feel empathy. We need to feel sorry. We need to be able to emotionally connect with the main character, who is the tragic hero. And this is why I say I know that this lesson on Macbeth and Elizabethan dramas was very tragic. Excuse me, difficult and challenging because it required an emotional response, because that is the whole point of dramas. It's not something to memorize. It's something that you have to experience. Literally, they are experiences. And so that is the point of dramas, in particular Elizabethan dramas.